Somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains, deep inside a stone fortress that hasn't seen sunlight in weeks, a woman is screaming. Not out of fear, out of joy. Because she is not a prisoner here. She is the queen of this castle. And those screams, they don't belong to her. They belong to the girls she invited inside. This is the story of Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the woman history would call the Blood Countess, the woman accused of murdering more than 650 young women, not for war, not for power, not even for survival, but because she believed their blood would keep her young forever. And the truly terrifying part? She almost got away with it. To understand how Elizabeth Bathory became a monster, or at least how the world came to see her as one, you have to understand what she was born into. Elizabeth Bathory was born on August the 7th, 1560, in the Kingdom of Hungary, into one of the most powerful noble families in all of Europe. The Bathory family wasn't just rich, they were royally connected. Her uncle was King of Poland. Her cousin would become Prince of Transylvania. Her family had been shaping the political destiny of Central Europe for generations. She didn't just have a silver spoon, she had a golden one, engraved with her family crest.
Growing up in Exeter Castle, Elizabeth received the kind of education that most noble women of her era could only dream of. She could read and write in 4 languages: Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. At a time when most women, noble or not, were considered little more than decorative property, Elizabeth was sharp, educated, and fiercely intelligent. She was also, by most historical accounts, strikingly beautiful. But her childhood wasn't without darkness. Historians have pointed to signs that Elizabeth may have suffered from severe epileptic seizures as a young girl, a condition that in the 16th century was terrifying and poorly understood. There are accounts of violent outbursts, moments of uncontrollable rage, possibly neurological in origin. Some scholars believe she may have also witnessed extreme acts of violence from a young age, including brutal punishments carried out on the family estate. Whether those experiences shaped what came later, no one can say for certain. What we do know is this. At 10 years old, Elizabeth was already engaged to be married. His name was Ferenc Nadasdy, the son of another powerful noble family. The marriage was arranged when they were children, as these things were. But unlike many forced unions of the era, by most accounts, Elizabeth and Ferenc actually developed genuine affection for each other. They married in 1575. Elizabeth was 15, Ferenc was 19. And because Elizabeth's family was actually more powerful than her husband's, she kept her last name. He took hers. She would always be a Bathory. Their life together wasn't exactly a fairy tale romance, but it wasn't entirely miserable either. Ferenc was a military man, a decorated soldier who spent months, sometimes years, away from home fighting in the long Turkish War. While he was gone, Elizabeth ran the estate. She managed the servants, handled finances, organized the household, and oversaw their lands. She was, by all accounts, exceptionally capable. But she was also alone. A lot. They had 6 children together, though not all survived to adulthood. And over the years, the long absences, the isolation of castle life, and whatever was already brewing inside Elizabeth began to surface in darker ways. Servants started to whisper. Rumors began to spread that the Countess had a temper, that she punished the maids too harshly, that girls who displeased her came away with marks on their skin, that sometimes they didn't come away at all. For a time, these were just rumors. Noblewomen of that era did have near absolute authority over their servants. Physical discipline, while brutal by modern standards, was not unheard of, and Elizabeth was a woman of enormous power in a society that rarely questioned the nobility.
So the whispers stayed as whispers. Then, in January 1604, Ferenc Nadasdy died. He was 47 years old. And Elizabeth Báthory, now a widow in her mid-40s, was completely, utterly alone, with all his power, all his estate, and no one left to answer to. What came after is where history gets truly dark.
After Ferenc died, Elizabeth moved to Chaktice Castle in present-day Slovakia, remote, elevated, overlooking a small village below. It was here, in the years that followed, that the atrocities allegedly reached their peak. The accounts, gathered later from servants, witnesses, and survivors, paint a picture that is almost too horrifying to believe. Young women, mostly peasant girls at first, were brought to the castle under the pretense of work, employment, a chance at a better life. For families struggling to survive, an invitation to serve at a noble household was an opportunity, not a threat. But once inside Chaktice Castle, many of them never left.
The testimonies describe torture, prolonged, sadistic, and methodical. Girls were beaten, burned, mutilated. They were left out in the cold, doused with water in freezing temperatures until they died of exposure. Some were starved. Some were subjected to acts of cruelty so specific and so repeated that they could not have been spontaneous. They had to have been planned.
And then there is the blood. According to the most sensational accounts, Elizabeth Báthory believed that the blood of young virgin women had rejuvenating properties, that bathing in it, literally submerging herself in it, would preserve her beauty, slow her aging, keep her young.
Whether this is literally what happened, or whether it's an embellishment added later by enemies or mythmakers, is something historians still debate. But the core fact that women died in that castle, many of them over a period of years, is not seriously disputed. The only question was how many. The number most often cited is 650. 650 young women. That figure comes largely from a diary allegedly kept by Elizabeth herself, in which she supposedly recorded the names and details of her victims. If accurate, it would make Elizabeth Báthory the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history, and potentially one of the most prolific serial killers of any gender, ever. For a long time, the disappearances went uninvestigated. Peasant girls going missing wasn't exactly front-page news in 17th century Hungary. They were poor, they were expendable. No one with power cared enough to look. But Elizabeth made a mistake. She got greedy, or perhaps just careless. She started taking girls from minor noble families, girls whose disappearances would be noticed, girls with fathers who had enough standing to complain to the right people. And around 1610, those complaints finally reached someone who couldn't ignore them. György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, essentially the second most powerful official in the kingdom, appointed by Emperor Matthias himself. Thurzó launched an investigation. Witnesses were interviewed, servants were questioned, and on December 29, 1610, Thurzó led a raid on Chaktice Castle. What they found inside, according to the accounts, was exactly what the rumors had promised. One girl dead on the floor, several others injured, imprisoned, barely alive, and evidence of what had been happening in those walls for years. Elizabeth Báthory was placed under house arrest on the spot. She never faced a public trial. Here's where the story gets complicated. and where the conspiracy theories begin. Elizabeth Bathory never appeared in court. She was never formally tried, never given the chance to speak in her own defense in front of a judge. Instead, her trial was conducted in absentia. Her co-conspirators, servants, and alleged accomplices were tried, convicted, and executed in her place. One of them, a woman named Dorothea Semtes, reportedly had her fingers torn off before being burned alive. Another was beheaded. Elizabeth herself was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment inside Chakchity Castle. Workers bricked up her windows. Her door was sealed, leaving only a small slot for food to pass through. She died there on August the 21st, 1614. She was 54 years old. No public execution, no formal conviction, no real accountability, at least not in the way we'd recognize today. And some historians have asked a genuinely uncomfortable question. Why? Why didn't Emperor Matthias push for a public trial? Why was a woman accused of killing hundreds of people essentially just locked in her room until she died? One theory: money. Elizabeth Bathory was extraordinarily wealthy. Ferenc had died in debt to the crown, and those debts were effectively forgiven when Elizabeth was imprisoned. Her lands and assets were quietly redistributed. If she had been publicly tried and executed, her heirs might have had legal claim to dispute those assets. A quiet imprisonment was tidier for everyone involved. Which raises another question. Was Elizabeth Bathory a monster, or was she also a politically convenient target? A powerful widow with no male protector, sitting on enormous wealth, surrounded by enemies who stood to gain from her downfall? The answer might be both. Modern historians are divided on Elizabeth Bathory. Almost no serious scholar denies that something happened at Chakchity Castle. The testimonies are too numerous, too consistent, too specific to be entirely fabricated. Women died there. That is not in serious dispute. But the more extreme claims, the bathing in blood, the 650 victims, the obsessive cult of youth, those are harder to verify. The confessions from her servants were obtained under torture, which makes them legally and historically unreliable. The diary, allegedly containing the names of 650 victims, has never been found. The surviving documentation is fragmentary, filtered through political enemies, and colored by centuries of retelling. What we're left with is this: a real woman, real victims, real cruelty. And layered on top of all of that, a legend built by fear, amplified by politics, and polished to a mirror sheen by every century that came after. Elizabeth Bathory became a vampire myth before vampires were even a formal literary concept. Her story influenced Bram Stoker. She became the subject of novels, films, operas, and heavy metal albums. She was absorbed into the cultural mythology of the monster, the beautiful woman who feeds on the young to preserve herself. It's a story that has never stopped being told, because it touches something primal, the terror of power without accountability, the fear of the woman who takes instead of gives, the horror of beauty built on suffering. Whether Elizabeth Bathory was a prolific serial killer, a sadistic torturer, a politically persecuted widow, or some tangled combination of all three, we will never know with certainty. But the castle still stands, and in the village below Chakchity, the locals still tell stories. They say if you walk up the hill at night, you can still hear sounds from the ruins. Whether that's history or legend, or just the wind moving through stone, I'll leave that up to you. Elizabeth Báthory died in 1614, bricked inside the castle she once ruled. She was buried at the local church at Countess, though her remains were later moved, reportedly because the villagers didn't want her body in their town. Even in death, no one wanted her close. The exact number of her victims remains unknown. The full truth of what happened in those walls may never be recovered, but her name has outlasted empires. The Blood Countess, the most prolific female serial killer in history. A monster made of real evil and real myth, and the silence of a world that looked the other way for far too long.